Hello and welcome to the Choirosophy Podcast. Everyone can get an A, but not everyone will. This episode in many ways is the live presentation sequel to episode 21, which was called Everyone Can Get an A. And then of course people wrote in and asked questions, and I've been thinking further about my practices since the 2 years ago since I put episode 21 up. So in a lot of ways this is like a sequel. In music education we frequently complain, especially on the internet where most of our complaining happens, that people don't think our class is a real class. And what do we do about that? Our jobs depend on enrollment numbers, and we feel pressured to give A's. And we have unfortunately confused concepts like rigor with talent and accessibility. Those types of things have gotten jumbled up. But the problem is if we present courses without rigor, academic standards, or measurable achievements, we are walking right into people's criticism, the ones who say that our class is not real. But see, that's where the tension comes in. The tension between that desire to put forth a real class, but then we also don't want kids to quit. In my experience, though, when quality education is offered, even in an elective, the opposite of quitting happens. More people arrive. Ultimately, it's because they know that things are being done well, and people like to do things well. So in this episode, we talk about a grading system where everyone's going to have to make a choice to do work, but they will believe early on in the school year that getting an A is possible. Of course, no teacher can make the horse drink once it's been led to water, which is where the other part of the idea comes in, which is that we've got to hold kids to the standards that we set. So tune in for a presentation, either audio or video, complete with rubrics, grading practices, writing curriculum, grading on growth, setting individual goals for students, and much more. This is the bulk of the presentation, but I have trimmed some of it off for length, so if you would like to hear and see the entire presentation, including the questions and answers from the audience, then you'll have to go subscribe to Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can jump on over there. You'll get the slides and the ad-free full version of this presentation. If you want to have your state organization, your regional organization, or your school district, or your school be choralosophized, the easiest way to do it is to go to choirosophy.com and look in the top menu and you will find a clinician request form. I would love to join you, so reach out and let's set something up. Since my summer presentations are over, the Patreon just got a big dump of goodies in the Google Shared Drive because I put all of my presentation slideshows on Patreon for member-only access. The best way to do that is to go to patreon.com/choirosophy. For less than a cup of coffee every month, you get access to the extra episodes there, as well as the extra content. The producers over at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Chandler Smith, Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Egrain, Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, Jeff Wall, Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm excited to be here. This morning we're going to be talking about I'm going to be with you 3 times today. This will be the most nerdy of all 3 of the sessions. Just warning you ahead of time. We're talking rubrics, we're talking grading, we're talking assessment. But I want to set it up just a little bit this morning first. Before, as you heard in the what I called the short version of my stupid bio there, that I direct a professional choir. I also direct a high school choir, and that's kind of weird. In that I started directing a high school choir first. And I lived in that world, but then in Kansas City, it's actually a pretty good place to be in terms of professional singing gigs. Like you can get paid to sing all over the city all of the time in choirs. And so I started doing that at a young age too. And I started to notice early on that if the kids in my classroom, and I teach 9 through 12, but if the kids in my classroom are being taught to listen, and if they're being taught to hear music in their head, it's quite remarkable what they can do comparable to the professional musicians that I was singing with on the evenings and the weekends. And so I started to hash some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about this morning. I started to hash it out 15, 16 years ago when I started to notice, okay, I've got students now who can sight read better than a whole lot more of the professional singers that I sing with. And that is still true. Now, do the kids sound as good as the adults? No, of course not. But can they get to the right answer, quote unquote, quicker? Yes, they can. And they can get there with more independently, with less help, Okay? And that ultimately came about in my career as something that I started to think about where I was never told that that was even possible, so I never dared to dream that it was possible. And I started to think about whether or not that was true. And so ultimately I came to this idea that, okay, so what are the challenges that get in the way of that type of result for a lot of teachers in a lot of situations? And the first one I thought of was just imagination. A lot of us just don't think it's possible. So once you've gotten over that hump, then the other challenges that matter come in, right? So once you've kind of believed that it's possible, then you can start to come across the other challenges. And it got me to another challenge, which is that in music education, we tend to have a big hurdle, which is that other parts of our institutions, whether it be our colleagues, our administrators, our school districts, whatever, don't see what we do as a real class that would require the rigor that it would take to get the kids to that point. So we have to not only sell it to the kids, but we have to sell it to our bosses, okay? So that's where I started to kind of think about what I'm going to be talking about this morning, which is that if we're going to grade in such a way that leads to rigor, but then deals with the other problem that we have in our class, where if it becomes too hard to get an A, it's an elective and kids will just quit. So how do we thread that needle? And started to come up with this idea that number one, we got to grade on growth. And in places that we're allowed to, I recognize that not every school would allow this, shed any concept of grade level expectations. Because we're in music in most places, I don't know how Alabama, but in Missouri, I don't have state standards set by a politician. I get to work within my school district to create our curriculum, which means I don't have to say a 9th grader must be able to do this. A 10th grader should be able to do this. 11th, I got rid of that. I used to do that. 10 years ago, I used to have grade level expectations because I thought that was better than no expectations, and it was, by the way. Grade level expectations are better than no expectations. But then I started to realize, as many of you probably have already realized, that kids come to a music class with a much wider range of background in that content area than, say, would come to a 9th grade math class. Because when they come to a 9th grade math class, they pretty much all have had to have the certain number of math classes prior to that, and maybe they're not great at math, but they've been exposed to it, and they've had the certain terminology built in, and they get to 9th grade and they're ready for that first year math class. We do not get that in most places in music. I might have a kid sitting in my beginning choir who is a piano lessons kid who's been on stage doing musicals their whole life, and they started taking voice lessons in 6th grade, and their mom already thinks that they're a star, okay? And helicopter mom, all of that kind of stuff is happening right next to a kid who has never been in a music class ever. And how do you effectively teach and assess classes that are that diverse in terms of background and content knowledge? So the grade level expectations went out the way pretty quickly for me when I realized that it's not only not realistic, it's not fair, but it also isn't conducive to learning. So we're going to dive in here and hopefully get to the end with some time for questions and conversations. Okay, so first problem, rigor and accessibility are not antonyms. We run into this problem sometimes where if especially in music, because it's hard for us to agree on what a high standard should look like, we're going to talk about that later, so sometimes the answer is to just, well, we shouldn't have high standards. But what I'm going to try to argue today is that you can have a very rigorous, thought-inducing, provocative struggle session of a class and have it still be something that everyone can get an A in. You can do both. You don't have to choose. In music education, we frequently lament cultural attitudes about music not being a real class, as I said before, and our jobs depend on enrollment numbers. Has anyone ever felt pressured to give an A? Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think part of that is because we've confused these two terms. Rigor does not necessarily mean that we have a choir that is really hard to get into and that we're excluding people, and as we have an audition, we're shooing people away. That's not the same thing. Rigor just means, to me anyway, that each individual student, if they're helicopter mom's kid or beginning kid, they're both going to have to show improvement over the course of the time in my class to get an A, which means they both can. It's a choice. Okay. Grading on growth. We're going to talk a little bit about this now. Imagine a music class where the most talented musician in the room has to show growth in order to get an A, and the weakest musician can be reinforced and reinvigorated. The master teacher, and I really believe this, is a master carrot dangler. Okay? And I don't care what subject that is, by the way, but a master carrot dangler is the one who knows just how far out that it needs to be at all times, because they recognize that if it's too close, the kid will grab that carrot so easily that they now think your class is a joke. And if it's put out too far, then they will just start to believe very quickly that they can't ever get there. Which for me, by the way, that mistake happened when I did, even though it was a necessary mistake in my growth, it was when I went to grade level expectations for individual sight singing. Because I test all my high school kids on individual sight singing at the end of each semester as part of their final. We started that process with grade level expectations. I use Sight Reading Factory, so we did it by levels. At the end of 9th grade, first semester, every 9th grader reads a level 2. And then at the end of the second semester, it's a level 3. And then sophomore year, they start level 3, go to level 4. Well, that worked fine for the average kid in the bell curve. But then I started to realize that those kids, it's the carrot again, right? So if for some of my kids, that was way too easy. Way too easy. Piano lesson kid, and it started phoning it in real fast, and they weren't learning and they weren't growing. For the kid who's struggling to match pitch, level 1's not appropriate, right? And so that kid started to believe really quickly that, well, this is just not for me. Okay? Now, overall, did my program get better during that time because we had expectations? Yes, it did. But it really started taking off when I removed that concept and started every kid from where they are at the beginning of the year. So what we do is we pre-test them in October to determine an appropriate goal for first semester. And for the kid who can't match pitch, maybe that's their first semester final. Can you sing a scale? If so, you get an A. Because you're going to have to be able to sing a scale if you're going to read a Sight Reading Factory exercise. So we got to start somewhere, and I don't care where it is. Now, I think probably the hardest thing about selling this to a classroom full of students, because we know kids compare themselves to each other also. Okay? That's probably the biggest hurdle here, is the psychology of convincing kids that it's okay that you're at sing a scale while your best friend is at level 3. That's okay. It doesn't mean you suck. And I won't lie to you, that is a hard sell because of kid psychology, and it takes a daily intentionality and reinforcing to them that everybody's bringing strengths. I want to remind you all that student travel is something that I think every teacher and every program needs to have as a goal. DCINY, Distinguished Concerts International of New York, is a fantastic, high-quality opportunity. If you're thinking about a trip, New York has to be at the top of the list. And if that is the case, then I want you to go to dciny.org and check out their various concert offerings to see if you can jump onto one, because they work well with you, they are awesome, and I think that they are a great company to work with, and I encourage you to check them out. The rigor problem in other academic subjects, teachers, parents, and students seem more comfortable with the idea of rigorous academic standards. We have that built into our culture. If you tell a parent why the science class should be rigorous, they're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Trying to explain to them why the music class should be rigorous is a harder sell. Okay? There are some reasons for this, and as anybody who listens to my podcast probably already knows, that I already think a lot of this is our fault in our profession. We have asked this of the community unintentionally. Part of it is that music is subjective. And as I hinted at before, we don't all agree on what the standards are. Okay? I don't see that as a problem, but many of my colleagues do. I don't see that as a problem at all that we don't agree. I think that's wonderful. I think it's wonderful that a rubric of standards in one place in the country or one classroom might be different than a rubric of standards in another class. Let's take just traditional high school chamber choir versus a show choir program. Do they have the same rubric for excellence? No, they do not. That is not a problem, as long as they have one. They've got to have one. And so I think sometimes the mistake we make is that because we don't all agree at the national organization level or the state organization level, we don't all agree on what those standards are, we shy away from saying that there needs to be one. Okay? So I love that in music we can set our own. I think that's a huge advantage. The other problem is that, and similar, is that those standards are culturally disparate. Many colleagues think that that's a problem. Again, for the same reason I don't. I don't. I think it's wonderful. I think that's one of the best things about music, is that we all have these musical laboratories of cultural exploration that happen all over the world and all over the regions and that kind of thing, which is wonderful. And probably the hardest one to talk about is that not all teachers are as good at this as other teachers. That makes it hard. And later this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more in kind of the ways that we as teachers owe it to our students to be better at what we do so that we can continue to stay out ahead of the kids. Probably in my lifetime, the best example I have of this is actually one of my former students, graduated in 2012, now sings in my professional choir. He got a degree in voice after he left me, decided he didn't want to do that for a living, sings in my pro choir, sings in church choirs in Kansas City, but now teaches German. Isn't that fun? But when he was my private voice student when he was in high school, he was the first young high school tenor that I had ever seen who had a better access to his upper register than I did, okay? Which meant that I had to practice for his voice lessons. It was very, very intimidating and very humbling, but I became a better singer from teaching his voice lessons because I didn't want to try to show him how to get through my passaggio and access the upper register above the staff when I couldn't do it. And of course, most of my high school voice students weren't there yet, so it didn't really matter. I could just show up and make them better, but not Vince. So this is where the teacher skills really matter. It's no matter where you are. Okay, we're going to start in now with the curriculum. I'm going to show some clips here of what mine looks like. Every school district has different rules. So nothing I present today has to become your curriculum in order for me to think it's good. This is just a way that I've formulated this. By the way, I teach in a relatively large district, 3 high schools of about 2,000-ish each school. The choral programs in all 3 of the high schools are very similar. We have 2 full-time teachers at each high school along with a full-time accompanist at each high school, so 6 total, 9 total choral staff in the district. And I somehow became the oldest in the choral staff in the district a few years back. I don't know when that happened. I was also very fortunate that they told us that our entire curriculum, this is for all subjects in our district, need to fit on 1 page. And I was like, yes, that's what curricula should look like. Because are we teaching essential concepts, or are we teaching drivel we learned in grad school? No offense, collegiate people. Okay? Essential standards are here, and then on my actual curriculum, the rest of the page is a little bit of jargon that you don't need to see. But the things I teach and also are the things that I assess. And that was kind of the key part of the writing of the curriculum is if I don't plan to assess it, it belongs nowhere on something that is essential. If I'm going to call it essential, the kids need to know that it's essential in the way that they are assessed. So sing while implementing the elements of proper vocal production. What does proper mean? It's not up to you, it's up to me. And that's okay. Okay? In your classroom, it's up to you. Apply concepts of historical and cultural interpretation through the performance of choral music. Demonstrate fluency in reading music notation. Fluency for me simply means the same. I try to use as many science of reading lingos as I can. Reading music is the same science as reading any other language. So fluency for me means the kid at whatever their appropriate level is can get through the passage of music without a lot of stopping and thinking and being confused. Because if I say that an English reader is fluent, I would need them to be able to open up a book and just read. Okay? So if they can't do that, they're not fluent. Develop and refine proper ensemble singing skills. This is our blend, balance concepts. Listen to, analyze, describe, and evaluate the music using the correct vocabulary. So the tip on here is that if you have an opportunity to rework your curriculum at all, start with a description of those ideal things. Like what is it that you boil it down? What do you want every student who comes, and I mean every student. What do you want every student to be able to do, talk about, experience by the end of your class, and then see if you can turn that into a curriculum. Work backwards, in other words. We've talked about assessing and grading on growth a little bit already, but individualize the goals. I think this is really important. It's not just with sight singing, but individualize the goals as much as you possibly can. Now, sometimes kids don't know what their goals are until they're like 6 months into the class, but I would actually say that's great. That's great. I don't know if, by the way, I should have probably done this earlier when we started. By a quick show of hands, I want to see what levels we teach. Middle school, elementary school. Okay. Now, of the middle schools and elementary schools, are we doing choirs, or is it general music, or both? Both. Okay. And then how about high school, secondary? Choirs, instrumental ensembles, both, mostly choirs probably. Okay. Collegiate folks. Okay. Now, see, I think a lot of these things I really do believe could apply at all of these levels, and that's kind of how I conceptualize them, because I think that ultimately the grade on growth thing, this is tricky because of the rigor thing I was talking about earlier. My resistance to grading on growth earlier in my teaching career was because I thought it would be less rigorous. Okay? I thought that by setting a standard, like maybe it's just the culture of education that I was raised in, but here's the standard, and if I let a kid not get here, then I'm not being a good teacher. Okay? And I no longer think that, because I've seen what happens when the carrot is dangled exactly at the right distance for every kid. I've seen that even though in theory, for some kids, I lowered the bar. Okay? 10 years ago me, 12 years ago me would have been very ashamed of myself for lowering the bar for any kid. Okay? But then I realized that over the course of a school year, my entire choir got way better, way faster, because every single kid started to believe that they could get better. Okay? Because they could, and I wish this wasn't so much part of our culture, but they need to know that they can get an A. They need to know that they can get an A. We all, as teachers, we love to say, well, like, it's not about the grade. Yes, it is. It is for the kid and it is for the parent. They do need to be able to have that goal of getting an A, especially in a music class. Yes?
I know I came late, I'm sorry. Can you define your definition of rigorous?
Yeah, so I did kind of tackle that at the beginning, but the short version I could say is that for me, rigor means that every kid is being held to a standard that will show that they must improve over the course of the school year. Okay, that's an oversimplification, but that's essentially where I went. Yep. Yeah, good. All right, so let's move into our first rubric. So one of the things that I do is I have everybody do part checks. Part checks are singing tests. We call them singing tests. They're quick and easy to grade, and of course, all of these assessments, you're going to do yourself a favor no matter what technology you can use to make the grading go faster, especially if you have large classes. But basically what we do is, let's say we've got a concert on October 15th. Around October 1st or 2nd in my class probably would be the first singing test, which means we've been working on those pieces. They know those pieces, they should anyway, know the pieces for performance, and then I start to think about, all right, so which portions of these repertoire that we're doing for this October concert might need the most zoomed in individual work from each kid. So I'm not talking about the part that's already the easiest. I'm talking about the part we're struggling with as a group. Then I might announce a couple weeks before that, hey guys, in 4 days we're going to have a singing test, and it's going to be on DSE Ray by Ryan Main, measure 22 to measure 45, and that's the test. And then 4 days later they come in, they knew there was a test, and that's a 3-part piece sometimes. And then, so that would be two music stands for tenors, 2 music stands for the tenor twos, and 2 music stands for the basses. And we come up 2 on a part, and I sit right in front of them. The class is all behind, as you are right now. And I have a Google form pulled up with this rubric. Okay? So the Google form allows me to pull up 6 tabs on my browser, and I've got their little 3-question thing. So it's notes and rhythms, tone production, ensemble singing skills. And I can either click 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in each category. So as they are singing, I've got an idea of what I'm listening for, and I'm simply clicking, click, 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 click while they're singing. Wait till the end if I have to kind of think about some of the kids' questionable places on the rubric. Click, 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 submit, next. The entire process takes 45 seconds to a minute to get each group. Okay? And we spend 2 or 3 class periods, if that's how many kids we have, to get that done. And then by the end, churns out a grade. And if are these questions about the rubric?
It's about the process.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Do you have the whole ensemble sing while those students sing in front of you? Or is it
Oh, no, they're on their own. They're on their own. Yep, groups of 2 on a part. It is to demonstrate that they have done their homework. Yeah.
The twos, like if you have a really struggling kid, you intentionally put him with someone who maybe is not a struggler?
It varies based on the level of the class that I'm dealing with. It also varies depending on the personality of the group, and we all know like different groups every year have different kind of vibes. But typically I let them choose whoever they come up with, because there's a certain amount where it doesn't really matter. In other words, that in a 2 on a part ensemble, it's really hard to hide. Like if you don't know what you're doing and I'm sitting 5 feet away, then it's obvious. It's obvious. So it ultimately doesn't matter. And I do also I coach them a little bit before we go through it on what is smart. So if you're a really light voice who doesn't make a lot of noise and your best friend is Loudy McLouderton, you probably don't want to come up together, because he's going to blow you out of the water and I'll never hear you. And I do explain to them that if I can't hear you, I can't grade you. This is like if it's in math class and you just hand in a blank piece of paper and say, oh, trust me, I know how to do all these equations. You'd get it. They know right away. Oh, I'd get a 0. Like, yeah, yes, that is also how it is. And so this partly falls into my definition of rigor. They are going to have to show me work. Okay. So in the notes and rhythms, I'll go through this rubric real quick. Notes and rhythms means no errors to get a 4. And I mean 0 errors. Not a note was a little bit early or a little bit late or a little bit sharp or a little bit flat. It was like a computer sang it. That's a 4. Okay. Tone production 4. These are my kids who are on their way to full ride scholarships at Pepperdine or Juilliard or Cincinnati. All staters. Okay. 4s for ensemble singing skills are kids who pretty much have it so memorized that they don't ever have to look at their music anymore. They are engaged. They are telling a story. They are breathing when their neighbor breathes. They're making eye contact. The whole thing is just flowing around them like the music is coming out of them. Okay, that's a 4. As you can imagine, I don't give very many. I don't give very many 4s. In fact, a 4 in tone production, for most of my kids, those top level kids will get a 4 for the first time their senior year, second semester, if they get one ever. So then, now we got to talk about then how does that translate into a grade? Because if the whole point is can they get an A, right? So what we do is we apply different grade level expectations, so to speak. It's really more experience level expectations to the kids based on the class and how many times they've been in choir and how many years they've been in choir, to the point where a freshman, one of our beginning level students, could get an A by living right here in the rubric. Why? Because that is reasonable for beginners. It is reasonable to think that a beginner might sometimes get their vocal folds to touch when they're singing, but not all the time. Whereas my senior who's been in voice lessons for 4 years, you should expect to be constantly phonating. Okay? But my freshman, to get a 2, that might mean that like they're singing that 15-bar passage and they sang through it, it's kind of breathy and but then all the came out and then and I'm like, yes, ooh, you got it there for a second. It's not there all the time, but then I get to call it emerging. Their voice is emerging. Okay? Same thing with the ensemble singing skills. Occasional errors, that's like every line of music, maybe they're making a mistake. These skills are there, but they're starting to emerge. They're not consistent yet. And since I get to decide where on the rubric an A lives, then I can attach it to that class based on its needs. And in some cases, in cases of IEPs or other types of things, I can attach what an A is to any place for any kid. It's up to me. There's another rubric I use. This one, probably of all the things that you will hear me talk about today, is the most practical one that for me changed the entire course of my career for the better, is this rubric right here. This got classroom management in my class to not be a thing anymore. Now, again, as I explain how I grade it, just like the singing test, it's a pretty rigorous standard. It's a very high standard. But for me, it's worked. Part of that is just the way I explain it to the parents, I think. But let me go through this. Have students complete a version of a self-reflection after the first 2 weeks. So what this is a kid in the first person telling me how they think they rehearse. Now, in my class, they don't get to grade themselves, but I do want them at the beginning of the year to fill out a self-evaluation so they can show me that they understand how I'm grading them. Okay? I can get those disconnects out of the way real fast at the beginning of the year if a kid is telling me that they're consistently doing all these things, but like I don't even know they're in the room half the time, right? There's a disconnect, and we can talk about it early in the year. So here's what I do. They get this in front of them, either on paper or Google form. In the first 2 weeks of in-person rehearsal, I know this is small on the TV, but it says consistently, frequently, occasionally, and rarely, and they fill in one of those 4 words. They consistently demonstrate proper body alignment. They consistently make adjustments to the vocal score using a pencil and whatever system of notation that we've learned or that they've decided upon. They consistently demonstrated an understanding of sound and silence and the role of each in an effective rehearsal or performance. Now that one has been huge because that was me, as I wrote this curriculum, tricking my administrators into letting me grade their citizenship academically. Okay? Used very fancy sounding words so that my administrators couldn't tell that what I'm really grading is do they shut up when I tell them to. And that is in a choir rehearsal, that is academic, I would argue. It is not a citizenship problem because we, as music teachers, we are sound lab technicians. We are creating soundscapes. And that little outburst that you just did, Timmy, in row 3 of the risers, that is not written anywhere on the music. That is the wrong answer. That is an academic problem because they're showing then at that point that they don't understand the role that their noises make in the creation of this art that we're trying to do. It would be like going into a science class and thinking it's totally fine to just throw some baby powder on the beaker or the test tube. That's no problem. Well, the science teacher also would have a problem with that because now the experiment is ruined. I've mixed baby powder in with whatever the chemicals we're supposed to be mixing in today, right? You get the idea. And then the last one is big too. In the first 2 weeks of in-person rehearsal, I was, my in-person is still left over from the dark times, by the way. I was consistently, frequently, occasionally, rarely engaged in the rehearsal. I define engaged for the kids, and of course we spend a lot more time than I'm spending today defining all these terms for the kids, but engaged for me is both physical and mental. What percentage of the time are you physically and mentally engaged in the rehearsal? That's essentially what we're looking at. And so engaged mentally, sometimes I explain to them very simply, is just where are your eyeballs? What are your eyeballs doing? If I say go to measure 22, let's talk about measure 22, and your eyes are on the ceiling, then I'm going to argue that I can very objectively mark that you were not engaged in the rehearsal. Physically engaged. We all do these kinesthetic things, right? And maybe I've asked them to stand up, and we're going to go via, via, via. And the kid goes, via, via, via. Is he physically engaged? I don't know why all my worst students are males, but in all my examples. Not engaged. Not engaged physically in the activity. I demonstrated a way that it should be, and you chose to not do that. Okay, so again, these are all things that we grade. So now here's where the rigor comes in. This will freak you out. Start doing math in your head. Each of these are worth 10 points. Consistently means they're doing it all the time. By the way, all the time without me having to remind them that it's an expectation. It's just this is what you're doing. Is 10 out of 10. Frequently means they're doing it most of the time. 7 out of 10. That's a C. Occasionally, hit and miss means I can't really predict ahead of time if that kid's going to do that thing or not. That's a 5 out of 10. Rarely, 3, 2, 1, depending on how rarely, out of 10. So what we do after that first 2 weeks is they fill in what they think they did, and then I ask them to start doing their own math. And if they started putting a bunch of frequentlies in there, and then I'll say, okay, so now add 7, 7, 7, and 7. Add that all up. They do that. Okay, now divide that by 4. What grade do you have today? And they're like, oh, I have a C. Okay, so let's talk about how to fix that. So I'm going to have to do these things more often. And then we talk about how, notice that by the way, this is half of their total semester grade is this rubric right here, how they rehearse. Okay? And so then we're able to talk about, notice that nothing on that rubric at all has anything to do with your talent what your voice sounds like, how good of a sight reader you are, whether you take voice lessons, whether you plan to take choir next year, right? None of these have anything to do with that. These are just choices you make. And any kid on an IEP can make these choices too. And I've seen that to be true, okay? So this is what ends up happening. Most kids, after doing one of these for me, one of these self-evaluations, we don't have to talk about it again the rest of the year. They understand. There are also the kids that kind of hold out to see what they can get away with. And so what I do then is if they're still struggling is I just make them keep doing the self-evaluation until they start to get it. But most kids get it after the first one, okay? We will have some kids, especially in my beginning tenor and bass class, that their first 2-week grade will look like it will be an F. And that there will be several of them. And then we will have the emails, as you all know. How could my kid possibly get an F in choir? How is it even possible to get an F in choir? And here's what I've started to do. I started this about 8 or 9 years ago. I do not answer those questions. Don't answer. I simply respond with, have you and Timmy read the rubric together? Because every single time the answer is the same. There's a rubric, and then I've got them. Because then we've established that this is a you problem. This is not a me problem. It is not my responsibility to explain the syllabus to you that you have not read. If you would like to read the syllabus and then set up a meeting with me, then it's okay. We can do that. But you've got to at least come into this meeting with a frame of reference. And what I notice in taking that approach, I'm always very polite, by the way, but in taking that approach, it takes the ownership of the problem and places it on that kid to where they understand that when they come to talk to me, this is going to be like about how do I fix this, rather than why are you mean?
Thanks for listening. I hope you got something thought-provoking out of that presentation. And again, if you would like to hear the rest, including the audience Q&A at the end, go over to Patreon, subscribe. You will find the full ad-free video there, as well as the private podcast feed that will allow you to download the audio version of this full ad-free presentation into your podcast player. As always, if you enjoy the content, please like, share, leave a rating. Use the promo code Choralosophy at checkout on Ryan Main, graphitepublishing.com, sightreadingfactory.com, and mymusicfolders.com. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.